Beautiful saints of God, there's a lot going on in the readings this morning, and particularly in the gospel that we just read, we hear some pretty harsh words from Jesus, both towards his disciples and towards the crowd, and addressed to us here this morning as well. So how do we interpret all of this? Firstly, we know that Jesus is out in the countryside. His reputation has been growing. We know that the crowds are following him. There's a lot of curiosity. He does these healing miracles. He's casting out demons. And all of this is happening at a time in the life of the nation of Israel where they are seriously experiencing the oppression of the Roman Empire. This is a people who are traumatized. This is a people who have lost their land. Politically, they have lost all of their rights. Economically, they are struggling and suffering. Socially, there is a lot going on. And there's this deep, perhaps well of hopefulness that somehow God is going to fulfill the scriptures and come and speak into this situation and save them with this Messiah. And so we see a threefold kind of movement in Jesus' conversation with us this morning. The first question Jesus asks in all of this, who do the people say I am? And once they answer that, he takes it down to a second movement. Well, who do you say I am? And then he takes it to the third movement of being that Messiah, what it means to follow me. And I cannot help but think about Peter. You know, I really love Peter. Peter always misses the mark. Like, Peter's always out of turn. Peter, in some ways, really represents me. You know, Peter completely misunderstands who Jesus is. He's able to identify Jesus and say, you are the Messiah. But in that expectation, he carries a whole lot of things that he's hoping God will do in that situation. And I can really relate to that, you know, knowing who God is, knowing that God is the creator of the universe, of all that is seen and unseen, that this God is the savior of the world, that this God is the redeemer of all my life and brokenness, and that in the world as well. I too come to God sometimes with expectations that somehow he'll swoop in like a superhero, you know, those Marvel comics, and just, change everything, just fix everything. And this is what Peter is saying to Jesus, because Jesus says, I am the Messiah, and yet I must go to Jerusalem, and I must be falsely accused, and I must be killed in the most horrendous way possible, in a manner that is reserved only for the worst of the human people, in a way that is so degrading. And Peter can't cope with this. And I wonder sometimes if I can cope with this. I wonder if you can cope with this God who turns everything on its head, with this God who doesn't necessarily show up like the superhero swooping in and making everything right. Go to Afghanistan and stop what's happening there. Make sure that the starving children have food. Yet what Jesus is telling us is that God is alive and at work in the world. God is alive and at work in us. And yet this God does this work in a very different way from our expectations. Jesus shows us a God of deep humility, a God filled with love for the whole created order, with a special place in God's heart for the sinner, for the outcast, for the lonely, for the vulnerable. A God who on the cross says, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. And so we sit with this very strange, wonderful, faithful God. And I don't know about you, but you've got to wonder, what is this cross that Jesus is calling me to take up every day? And I'd like to offer that I have been pondering this question for many, many many years, because you know, as priests, we preach on the same text over and over. And I think I'm growing in some understanding of this. I think what Jesus perhaps means is that every single day as his disciples, we must understand the consequence that we will face of following and believing and trusting in a God of love. A God whose love is so unconditional. A God who is so accepting of our brokenness, of our foibles, of the many ways in which we miss the mark and harm ourselves and one another. That this God, to follow and entrust our lives to this God, means that we are going to be a very peculiar people. We are not going to be well understood. We are not going to behave in the way that the world behaves. In short, we are not going to be Pavlov's dog. You know that one? We ring the bell, the dog salivates. Ring the bell. We don't react the same way that other people do. And it's only as we come to claim our identity in this God, as we allow this God of love to completely claim us, that we will be transformed into this people of God. And carrying that cross means that there is a cost to it. We will often be seen as foolish. We will often be seen as weak. We will often be seen as unsuccessful. We will often desire things that other people cannot understand. And yet the beauty of this relationship is one that grows through time. We begin this walk with Jesus by listening to who other people say this God is. Perhaps Reverend Anastasia knows who this God is, or maybe the bishop knows, or I read something by Thomas Merton, maybe Thomas Merton knows who this God of love is. And then Jesus starts to ask each one of us, but who do you say I am? And in that question draws us into a deeper, more personal relationship. Who do you say I am? And as we journey into that, as we journey into this God of love and allow this God of love to claim us, we take up our cross daily and we follow him. And this is the wisdom of God that is foolishness to humankind. This God of love who will give his own life to save the most vile sinner. And this is the God we are called to reveal to others, not just through our words, but through the way we live our lives, through the way we respond to this thing called life. And that is a deep mystery, and we do it as a community of believers and as a community of faith. And we will often miss the mark, and we will often have expectations, and yet God remains faithful to us in that process. So I want to end with something practical, because as you know, my mother's going to watch this sermon and she's going to say, Anastasia, you were so heavenly high, you earthly no good. Even the peacock agreed. I'd like to offer as a practice, just for this week, to take seriously what James is offering in his letter to us about the tongue, the power of the word. I'd like to offer that this week, can we speak only with love? And should something happen and you cannot speak with love, may I encourage you to be silent. And let us go into this week really being deeply aware of the words that we use, and use them only in love. Speak our truth with love. And let's see how that experiment goes. You can message me and tell me how it's going. Maybe some of us will have a very quiet week. I think Tam's praying for that his wife is going to be very quiet this week. And then, as we watch our words, I offer something that I heard this week from St. Ignatius of Loyola. Pray as if everything depended on God. Pray as if everything depended on God, and work as if everything depended on you. In the name of Christ.